The 1960s were a time for change, self-discovery, and each person had a unique view on culture. During this time, sexism and racism was evolving and a social revolution was beginning. The older generation was perplexed and didn't know how to handle the change, so thus the hype of the 60s began. In the beginning of the 60s, Americans were in favor of the country's new president, John F. Kennedy, who had to deal with many conflicts. One of the issues he worried about most was the possibility of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear war was a large threat in the 60s. Americans had to understand procedures and emergency evacuations in case of nuclear threat. President Kennedy also had to deal with racism. Many places were yet to be desegregated, so in 1963, President Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill to Congress. Because of his actions, America began to take the path of equality. The wanting to move into a modern age influenced the art in America during the 60s. An artist goal was to inspire viewers to go and experience art in their own way. Literature was also parallel to what was going on in the country. In To Kill a Mockingbird, racism was exemplified through the different social classes. America was beginning to get a taste of feminism through literary works. Women like Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, and Gloria Steinem led the way for many women. Movies and television were also a big step for Americans in the 60s. Television offered the second primetime cartoon show, The Flintstones, in 1960. Many movies like James Bond and Dr. No combined racy images and violence but were enormously popular. Previous taboos on violence and language were ignored, which resulted in the need for a new film code by the MPAA. There was a major change in popular music in the mid-1960s, caused in part by the drug scene. Acid rock, highly amplified, and the more mellow rock gained recognition. The music hit of the decade was Woodstock, a 3-day music festival that drew 400,000 hippies and featured peace, love, and happiness. Also with the drug of choice, which was then LSD. Artists that were popular, like Elvis, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones, and so many more, still receive recognition today. It is then fair to say that the 1960s era of music was groundbreaking, and the path was set for the future for the musicians to come. The 60s featured a number of diverse trends. The new diverse trends mirrored the many social movements during the decade. In the middle of the decade, skirts, dresses, and go-go boots were popular. People were dressing in psychedelic prints, highlighter colors, and mismatched patterns. The hippie movement late in the decade was also a strong influence on men's clothing styles. Those included bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye, as well as paisley prints. The 60s was the beginning of professional sports achieving dominance over American sports fans. The continuous seasons of baseball, football, and basketball offered sports fans year-round entertainment. Professional football became the most popular American sport in the 1960s when it surpassed baseball in attendance and in television viewership. The two leagues, the NFL and the AFL, played their first championship game, the first ever Super Bowl, against each other in 1967. With the expansion of the sports industry, more money could be put into the economy because of the prices of tickets and apparel and such. Despite the social upheaval, the 60s were a time of increasing economic affluence. The inflation-adjusted expendable income increased by 36% over the decade. Women's participation in the workforce rose from 38% to 43%. Unemployment fell steadily, declining from 5.5% in 1960 to 3.5% in 1969. The 60s were able to influence our society today. The civil rights movement took steps that were necessary to the growth of Americans. Finally, people were standing up for what they believed in, equality. In 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it showed Americans change was about to come. Today, discrimination has come a long way, and people are not as prejudiced as they were back in the 60s. This is due to the fact that the 60s were a time of radical thinking. The entertainment business has a lot of influence over people in the 60s and today. It began in the 60s with the beginning of rock and roll. The amplified musical rock sounds reached across America, and suddenly not every person was listening to the same music. This was a turning point in our country because it changed the way people thought. Due to music, drugs and fashion statements came into societal view. The music Americans listen to today reflect on the music made in the 60s. The new genres of music were also a good thing because it was expanding the music industry. Other genres of music came to light and the sales of records went up. Music contributed to the economy because people were pouring their money back into the economy to buy records and then CDs. Music was the major stepping stone to the entertainment industry because of its innovation of the rock genre. Finally, the thought of war hit home with many Americans. People and politicians realized that America needed to rely on other countries to survive, just like other countries rely on America. Americans understood the threat of war could result in extreme situations. This was a turning point for Americans because now they understood how dangerous things could get. The United States cannot just throw the country into a situation where they don't belong. After the threat of nuclear war, Americans suddenly realized how dangerous new technology really could be. The 60s is definitely an era to remember and never forget. The American people truly tried to exemplify democracy because they wanted to choose what was being done in the world. People began to explore who they truly were and found out where the true dangers of the world lie. It is clear that the events that occurred in the 60s had an effect on society that is exemplified in the 21st century.